Hi Booktube, and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads. Carole Maso, The American Woman in the Chinese Hat. Great title. Charlene Elsby, The Devil Thinks I'm Pretty. Rachel Cusk, Parade. Emily Hall, The Longcut. Gausch, who's a Catalonian author, Napalm in the Heart, and this was translated by Mara Faye Leatham. And a book I'm not going to talk about today because it's probably going to get a video all of its own. Monsieur Cartarescu's Solenoid, which is a buddy read with Bob Black, and this was translated by Sean Cotter. As I say, I'll probably give it its own video. The only reason I've sort of introduced it today, apart from the fact it's been a recent read, is that quite a few of these books cross over in terms of theme with some of the Solenoid's themes. Okay, so I'm going to start with Carole Maso, The American Woman in the Chinese Hat. So this is my second Maso book. I recently read Ava, and I'll leave a link to my review of that. And like that book, this is 5 stars. It's maybe less experimental than that, but no less enjoyable. I think if you're a fan of the work of Marguerite Duras, you'll like this book very much. So an American woman has written a novel, has had a novel published, and she's been given a grant to facilitate her writing the second book, and she's gone to the French Riviera, which means she's apart from her 10-year-long lesbian partner. And the book opens with a really brilliant bit of sort of sensuous writing about the French Riviera and the French at leisure, the weather, the light, the sea. It's just gorgeous, sumptuous writing. And that persists throughout. But unfortunately for this woman, her partner informs her that the relationship is over. That the partner back in the States is fed up with the neglect that this writer has shown her, because she's always sort of committed to her art, or one of the themes in Solenoid. But also, you know, she's been unfaithful, the woman in France, and that sends her into a spiral of sex with both men and women. And hilariously, one of the episodes is with a fireman who turns out that he's a Le Pen supporter. He's in the Front National, as it was then called. And it's very, very funny. I mean, it shouldn't be, but it is. But anyway, so she meets this after a series of flings, she meets this guy, and the rest of the book, so sort of 2/3 of it, is their relationship. It's very passionate, it's very, it's full on, but they're both locked in their isolation, and can their loving relationship pierce that for one, or hopefully for either, both. I'm not going to spoil the ending, but as I say, I just thought it was terrific, it was sensuous, it was a page turner, 5 stars. And Charlene Elsby, The Devil Thinks I'm Pretty. So Charlene Elsby has written several books where they have strong central female characters who are at odds with the world. They don't fit in. And in a bit of the style of A.M. Holmes, occasionally they sort of burst out into these really surprising actions that, you know, sort of seem to come from nowhere. Holmes is much more embedded. But what I particularly liked about this, apart from the voice, is I felt that when something, you know, extreme happens, it's embedded, it's organic, it grows out of what's come before. So although it still may be shocking, it makes sense, it follows a logical path of psychology or whatever, which hasn't always been the case of her previous books. So I thought the start of this book, and when I say start, I mean, you know, 4/5 of it, I thought was tremendous, and my favourite of her books so far. It's a great voice, as I say, and that is the voice of a 14-year-old girl who lives in a trailer with her mother, and her mother dies, but the girl manages to stay on the trailer and continues going to school because she also has a job in a diner. And the first third of this book, or first half of this book, she's, you know, basically just trying to get by, just trying to make it, you know, through all these three different worlds. The world of keeping body and soul together in her trailer all alone, the world of her school, and the world of the diner. And the only strange thing is that she's aware, she has a sense of the devil, a literalised figure, but the problem is the devil won't really reveal his purpose for her or what she wants to undertake. And that all changes in the second half, at the beginning of the second half, where she's got a boyfriend at school, and a new boy comes to school who quickly befriends her boyfriend, and becomes part of, you know, they're a sort of tight threesome. And they have a menage a trois, not a menage a trois, they have a threesome in bed. And that seems to sort of turn the world upside down for her. After that, anything goes. And she's got an idea of you know, what the devil is about. So I'm just going to read. We do define people according to what's been done to them, not what they have done. That's where God had it all wrong. There wasn't a judgment at the end of your life of all the things you had done. There was a judgment of all the things done to you. Most of the reason you are the way you are has nothing to do with you. There shouldn't be commandments, I thought. Not ones that tell you what to do and what not to do. That's what's really important, is what's done to you. Done and not done to you. God says thou shalt not kill and thou shalt not steal, but worse off is the person who is dead or has nothing to offer. If God is pure activity, then being passive is the problem. For everything that's done to you without your having done it, you're worse off than you were. For all that fucking moralising, the Gospels forgot to mention that the best of all beings is the thing that's doing. So she's become aware of what the devil represents, what the devil's about, and she has a supreme confidence all of a sudden. She's not this sort of shy and retiring sort of 14-year-old, you know, living this life of school diner trailer. She's much more sort of assertive, and she dominates the relationship with her boyfriend. And it's really good until the final 20 pages where, and that's why I'm not to star off this, that's why I've given this 4 stars and not 5, where the three of them and another girl that they've sort of taken into their circle as a plaything, really, they resolve they're going to make a movie, and it's presented here as scripted, although it might be a transcript of the movie. That's not clear, but I don't think that's important. But it's very much, you know, sort of in real time, sort of slightly documentary feel, despite it being possibly scripted. And it's really the apotheosis of her thoughts and of the sort of being in the devil's camp. And the problem with it is that, unlike everything that's been previous, and there's some pretty gruesome stuff leading up to this, but this film script is just not organic. It doesn't develop organically. You know, the gross act at the heart of it seems, you know, gauze for gore's sake, horror for horror's sake. It's not embedded in the psychology as much or as cleanly as the earlier stuff. I mean, it was almost inevitable that it was going to end up there from a plot point of view rather than a psychology point of view. So, as I say, I did knock a star off for that, because I did feel that, you know, that was a shame, because if it continued on in the tone and the vein that it displayed up to then, it would have been 5 stars. And on to Parade by Rachel Cusk. I can't believe I fell for her shtick again. This is the 4th or 5th book I've read by Rachel Cusk. The last one of hers I read was the first of her trilogy called Outline, and I did a dedicated video, which I'll post the link to, as to why I admired its experimental bravura, but also I think it felt absolutely flat on its face. And I don't think this was as experimental. You have to admire an author who's prepared to sabotage her own work, as I felt she did in Outline and as I feel she's done here. Because it's a book in 4 parts. The first 2 parts are really interesting. There's lots of musings about art, and it's sort of personalised. And then the problem with parts 3 and parts 4, part 3 is just one extended dinner party conversation, which I always hate in film, I hate in books, because it's so static. It's just people talking, it's just ideas. And it's not a dinner party in someone's house, it's a dinner party outside in a piazza I think in Italy, and more people join. But it's just completely unsatisfactory. And then part 4 is about 2 people whose parents are dying, and they go and visit them, and it doesn't really go anywhere. It doesn't really quite fit in with the rest of the book. But you know, problems I always find with Rachel Cusk are always twofold. One is she's very cold and unemotional. She's very intellectual, and that permeates here. And the second is she seems to me to be very restricted in the types of people she writes in terms of class. There are 2 characters in here who give up their jobs, but they don't have other jobs to go on to. But they have the privilege of somehow being able to do that. Now, I couldn't afford to give up my job. But these people don't seem to have any responsibilities or have enough money to cushion them from it. And that's fine as characters, but because you get no contrast to that, both in here and in Outline. I mean, in Outline it was even worse, because there it was about storytelling and the human drive to tell stories, which is fine. But every character in there who was studied by Cusk, and it is a study because the main character is almost mute, they were all writers and artists, as if only they get to tell their stories, as if only their stories make the world. And it's this sort of elitist privilege thing that, you know, smacks through everything that Cusk does. I'm just going to read you some examples of to demonstrate what I mean. So as I say, it started off really well. So she's talking about she's the wife of an artist. She's not really a muse, but this is the artist reflecting. His wife's freedom, so partial and malformed, had a crippling effect on him. She was only a few feet away. He could neither use her nor dispense with her, could not, because of her, be entirely free himself. It was her undeveloped equality with him that was crippling. She was not the pure object of his desire, nor was she his rival and equal in power. Instead, she was his companion. She situated herself there, only a few feet away, in the terrain of weakness, of need, of plain daily requirements. Yet she herself could be desired. The father, for instance, was beadily watching her body move through the caressing bands of dark and light. Why did she not make a proper use of her power one way or the other? When G tried to see her, he simply saw his effect on her, saw, in other words, himself. Another man looking at her would see something different. This, he realised, was what he was unable to tolerate. It was unbearable that she could take his power of sight away from him and still be seen by everyone else. When he looked at her, what he saw was his sexual failure as an animal, a failure brought about by the interference of society and civilization itself, in the courage and capacity of their own bodies. Perhaps men had always painted nudes in the same way as they committed violence, to prove that their courage had not been damaged by morality and need. Now, I'm not going to analyse that, but there's a lot of interesting psychological relationship observations, you know. It was unbearable that she could take his power of sight away from him and still be seen by everyone else. That sort of jealousy and you know, the power that a woman has and withholds from a man. I mean, there's lots of good stuff in that paragraph because it's specific. It's to these 2 people, the husband artist and the wife companion. So it's really rooted, it's really grounded, and I liked a lot of that. But then, you know, in part 3, we get similar sorts of philosophical observations about life, but they're completely abstracted. They're not attached to characters. They're not given specific psychological weight. They're not attached to objects. She wanted us to be finished, but we could never be finished. Sorry, just letting a motorcycle pass there. We kept existing and ruining the order of things. We got into trouble for existing in this way. Her anger was easily aroused by disobedience and contradiction. Nothing we did wrong could be forgotten, and so as we grew older we felt more and more uncomfortably weighed down by our characters, which seemed to have been imposed on us. Her ambitions for us were uncomfortable and didn't seem to fit us. We were embarrassed by the story she had fashioned for us. What story? And the roles we had been given. We discovered that for the story to work, a great deal of licence has to be taken with the truth. The strange feeling of liberation at her death was in fact our liberation from this story. But why had she created it? She's talking about her mother there and their terrible childhood. But there's no examples. It's not anchored to any specifics that you can grasp and get hold of, you know. Her anger was easily aroused by disobedience and contradiction. Fine. Give me an example. Nothing we did wrong could be forgotten. And so as we grew older, we felt more and more uncomfortably weighed down by our characters. Her ambitions for us were uncomfortable and didn't seem to fit us. What ambitions? Why does it make you feel uncomfortable? You're talking about several siblings. Have they all got the same ambitions, or have they got different ambitions but still are affected in the same way? This is what I mean. It's just abstracted. And this is where it's moved away from characterisation of the first example I read to abstracted ideas, to philosophy. And it doesn't work. And it's not good literature. It really isn't. And just, you know, some more examples of, again, how she can write. And it's so odd that, as I say, the first half of this book is really interesting, and then she sabotages it with the third and fourth part. The children are in an art gallery. It's like a school trip. The children ran around directionlessly, screaming and laughing amid the discarded activity sheets and the smells of food from the cafeteria. There was a mild sensation of pandemonium, of a substanceless kind of anarchy, like people misbehaving in church. I'm not sure that works as a simile, but anyway. But this church of art was too fragile in its sanctity. Nice. Its core of belief was too menaced and lost for it to bear much public iconoclasm. The moral good of culture and the values of entertainment were already locked in a dance of death and needed no further encouragement. See, that's brilliant. That's a brilliant analysis. But then... I'm getting really annoyed with this motorcyclist. Oh, don't do that, Mark. Again, an artist's observation of her work and her life. Later she went to the boys' parents' gallery with a portfolio of her work. Her memory of this period was both keen and opaque, dazzlingly strange. The magnificent intrusion into her private world like footprints in virgin snow. Bit of a cliche, but okay, we can allow it. Later she saw it as simply another example of the way her painting functioned autonomously, living in her like some organism that had happened to make its home there. It had never failed to sustain itself. Again, an interesting observation, and one at the heart of this book, which I'm going to come on to next. And finally, she often wished, she's talking about her daughter, she's often wished they could share a body as they had when she was pregnant. But then again, by being born, the girl had returned G to herself. It was this return, with its increase in the form of the girl, that was revelatory. G wanted to run away with her, but the problem of the baby's body and who it belonged to prevented her. She identified the baby with everything that was true about herself and with the secret they shared. Her power of sight was doubled now that the baby's perspective was added to it. She started to see good and evil in what had up until now been the pressing disorder of reality. See, I think that's really good, because she's talking about a specific person reflecting on what it means to be a mother and having the responsibility for another person and yet allowing that person their own perspective. I thought that was terrific, but it's all thrown out the window. It's all subverted by the rubbish that the second half of this book turns out to be. 2 stars. And as I say, The Longcut by Emily Hall is also about art and artists and similar themes to both the Rachel Cusk and to Solenoid. I think it's more successful than Cusk because it stays on track to the point, actually. It's an interior monologue pretty much, and it never really veers in tone or pace. Normally that always leaves me feeling a little, not cheated, but a little disappointed in a book. I don't demand changes of pace and changes of tone, but I think the writer, when they resort to that, is setting themselves up for potential failure, and I don't think she fails, but I was a bit ho-hum. I mean, I gave this 3 stars, whereas I gave that 2 stars. It is more successful, but I would have liked a bit more variance, a bit more variation. So basically, most of the action of this book takes place on a walk where an artist has been afforded a meeting with a gallerist to see if the gallerist will take her work. And her friend has got her this meeting. So she's walking from her house to this meeting in New York. And the journey is a consideration of, well, what is my art? You know, not only that she needs to know that for the gallerist, but it's a much deeper, profound reflection on quite, you know, what her art is about, where she should go next, all these sorts of things. She's a struggling artist. She has a tiny flat, and in that flat apartment, and in that apartment is her so-called studio, but it's not really a studio. She has a day job in an office to pay the bills. She can't afford artist materials, so sometimes she steals or borrows things from the office, stationery particularly, to make her art, to give her materials. Now, she's in 2 minds about that, because it's like, well, is this found art, or is this just sort of gestural art, you know, trying to make something profound out of the very mundane? And part of the reflection of this book is, what is the dividing line between reality, the everyday, and something transformative and transcendent in the form of art? And as she says, do artists chase meaning, or does meaning chase artists, demanding that, you know, they find the meaning that's sort of buried in the objects? See if I can find the actual quote. What in your work created the pull and dive and the spiking out in time that produced meaning in the most gratifying and woken up encounters, held your brain in tension with your senses, spiked your mind for you to back and into the future, sometimes, moreover, without your say-so, without being routed through your cognitive apparatus? Do artists chase meaning, or does meaning chase artists? Seemed to me, as I slogged, to be not an irrelevant question. Are other artists rinsed with regret was another non-irrelevant question. Did other artists regret chasing or being chased when they should have instead done the other? Did they ever, that is to say, regret the answer to the question of what their work was? So it's constantly she's interrogating what art means to her, subjectivity, objects and objectivity, but it's perpetual. It never shifts from that. Yes, her ideas move on and her definitions move on as she sort of makes connections, but the whole tone of the book is always in that register. And as I say, I find that slightly restricting. There are several other artists that she talks about. One is a printmaker, so she's not making her own original art. She is servicing other artists on an aesthetic level by, you know, doing the printing of their invites or whatever it may be. And that printer has a child, and that sort of throws the whole question of being an artist versus living real life and growing up and all that sort of thing. Again, a major theme in Solenoid. You know, it throws that into question. You know, which is it? Can one, you know, transcend the mundane and you know, avoid the sort of everyday humdrum life of being a parent and paying the bills and stuff? So that's one of the questions that she asks herself. And she's in the office that she's in. Her cubicle is being renovated, so she's shifted to another area in the office where there's a window, and in the distance there are cranes doing, you know, rebuilding the skyline. And she thinks that the way that the cranes move can form, you know, a body of work just by representing that, or the matrix of light of the sun moving across and what it does on her ceiling. Maybe that is a form of art. So she's reacting to the everyday and to real objects and trying to transform them in ways that maybe they can't be transformed. You know, the urge to be an artist is to rise above reality, to sort of be transcendent. It is a demiurge. It is a, you know, part human, part God. And there's a great presumption that you can rise above your station, your mere mortal station, not in terms of being immortal, although some would argue that a legacy of art does make the artist immortal, which I disagree with, but anyway. But there, you know, this was the thing that brought down all the Greek tragic characters, the Greek tragic heroes, was this belief that they were of demiurge status, that they were better and superior to the rest of man because they were prepared to raise their head above the parapet. So, you know, again, there's lots of good ideas, there's lots of interesting sort of reflection and meditation in here, but it's intactness throughout, not a couple of stars off it, 3 stars. And on to Napalm in the Heart by Paul Gausch, as I say, a Catalonian writer. Now, I've heard about this book on Twitter, and I got into discussion with someone who was talking about it, and I got the impression, which probably is my fault, that it was going to be much better than this turned out to be. I think he is a poet, and I thought the language, he was going to do things with language, which he doesn't at all, I don't feel. And ultimately, it's just another post-apocalyptic dystopian novel. So, you know, one part The Road, Cormac McCarthy's The Road without the cannibalism, one part Pink Slime, where the exact nature of the apocalypse isn't revealed. You know, you get certain clues as to what they're having to cope with. But the problem I have with dystopian novels, I've always been over them. I don't think I've ever been into them. I've been into post-apocalyptic films like Rollerball or like Total Recall or like Terminator, but not in books, because in books, once you're already in the dystopia, and most dystopian novels start after the catastrophe has happened, which I always find bemusing. It's much more interesting to have it described in the moment as society is collapsing. And indeed, I wrote my own book, An Eye for an Eye for an Eye, in a sort of dystopian way, but I was describing the slide of society into that dystopia. But I was doing it very much as a sort of... I wanted to see not only whether I could do a genre book, there are other genres involved, it's not just dystopian, in a highly literary manner, i.e. with sort of the highest values of language. But also, I was not parodying so much, but I was writing it as a non-believer in genre, in dystopia. Anyway, that's by the by. I'll leave a link to that. It's only on Kindle if you're interested. But the problem, as I say, with dystopian novels is because they don't have any movement in terms of the society moving from a better off stage to a catastrophic dystopian one. That's not portrayed. You're plunged straight into the post-apocalyptic status. It just becomes plot bound. If you think of The Road, and yes, there are some sort of metaphysical meditations in that, but it's still fundamentally plot bound of the father and son getting from A to B across a very difficult landscape. And I read a book called Death is Hard Work by a Syrian author, which is not dystopian, but it's about a brother, I think 2 brothers and a sister in Syria. Their father dies and they want to bury him where he was born, in a different city. But this is during the Syrian civil war, so there's all sorts of difficulties and challenges they face getting across the country. But to me that's much more satisfying a read, because it was rooted in a reality. You know, it was a failed state that they were travelling through, but it wasn't a dystopia. That's the point, you know. So in here, a mother and her son are in what's called the affected zone. We don't know quite what that means. We get lots of clues that lots of people died. Other people are marched off into basically be burned for fuel. It's not clear who gets chosen for that and who doesn't. The son shouldn't have been there, but that he hid every time someone knocked on the door, and now he's of an age that he's sort of safe, at least in that respect. The problem is for him in this society is, despite it being futuristic and post-apocalyptic, he's gay, and even his mother despises that fact, let alone everyone else in the community. So, you know, he's just completely sort of distrusted because of this. But having said all this stuff about the horrible nature of the society that they're in, actually he and his mother seem to have quite a decent life within the restrictions. And indeed, he himself, the author himself, says this. But when you think of an experience as lovely, here it must mean that you're experiencing it wrong. Nothing can be lovely here, not now. Well, he says that, but in terms of the food they grow for themselves and the hunting and all of that, I mean, it wouldn't be how I choose to live my life in a sort of civilised first world nation in a built-up conurbation. But in the context of this book, they seem to have a life of royalty. Unfortunately for the character, his mum dies. And his lover, so in the first half of the book, he's only been writing letters to his lover, who's back in a city somewhere. The second half starts with the lover showing up, and they're going to go, they're going to take the mother on a journey, which is why I talked about that Syrian book. The dead mother, they're going to bury her somewhere because she doesn't want to be buried she said before she died, she doesn't want to be buried in the affected zone. And the second part of this book goes absolutely nowhere. I mean, it does physically because they're on a car journey. And yes, there are 1 or 2 challenges like there were in the Syrian novel. But it's not very interesting. It's not really a quest. It's a bit sort of undefined as to what their purpose is. Yes, they're going to bury the mother. They get captured a couple of times and there's a checkpoint and there are all these sort of fairly standard things. The lover, who's called Boris, is a deeply unpleasant character. He's not nice at all. And in a way, this sort of great act that the protagonist had to do in part 1 of the book, and he was egged on by Boris because Boris is seeking revenge for the death of his own parents in whatever the catastrophe was that came down, which we still don't know, but it cost the lives of Boris's parents. And he manipulates his lover into sort of this act in order to get revenge. Well, why doesn't Boris do it himself? So the whole second half of this book, I just felt it fell to pieces. I didn't understand where it was going. It had no purpose. It was very plot bound. Oh, now they're at a checkpoint. Now they've got to escape this sort of, terrible situation, whatever it was. Plus, Boris was so horrible. You questioned everything about what you thought was the loving nature of their relationship based on the letters in part 1. There are no more letters in part 2, obviously, because they're together. He doesn't need to write him letters. So this just sort of felt utterly flat to me. And the language is not poetic. The language, I thought in the conversation over Twitter, that, as I say, that something remarkable was done by language, and it was lyrical too. But I didn't see any of that in this book. 2 stars. So there you have it. As I say, my next video will be dedicated to Solenoid, all 638 pages of it. I don't know how many you can see, but there's lots of little post-it notes. I need to sit down and go through all of those and draw them into some sort of coherency. That'll be my task for the weekend. So till next time, thanks very much.